Now, without further ado, I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Robert Anda. In the early 1990s, Dr. Anda began a collaboration with Dr. Vincent Folletti at Kaiser Permanente in San Diego to investigate child abuse as an underlying cause of medical, social, and public health problems. This effort led to a large-scale study funded by the CDC to track the effects of childhood trauma on health throughout the lifespan. They called it the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, commonly known as ACEs. Dr. Anda played a principal role in the design of the study and serves as its co-principal investigator and co-founder. Data collected from more than 17,000 patients for the ACE study clearly showed that adverse childhood experiences were common and had a profound negative effect on the health and well-being. The study also showed that ACEs were a prime determinant of the past, current, and future health behaviors, social problems, disease incidence, and early death in the study population. These findings have resulted in more than 70 publications in major medical and public health journals, and the ideas from this work are now influencing the design of similar research and practices around the world. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rob Anda.
Thank you, Gail. I appreciate that. And welcome, everyone. I'm glad to spend the next couple hours with you. I am going to go ahead and share my screen. And let you know that I am going to be talking for an hour or maybe a little over an hour about adverse childhood experiences. And I hope that when I'm done, for those of you who are not familiar with them, that you will understand the concepts. For those who've seen this before, that it will bring you to a deeper understanding. And I'm going to be talking about this concept of self-healing communities that is a foundation, I think, the public health foundation for how this information about adverse childhood experiences and what we've learned about the biology of how these experiences influence human development can be a foundation for community-wide population-based change and prevention of many health and social problems. During this presentation, I will be presenting data and I guess what I would consider science, and I'm also going to be telling you about some of my ideas and concepts, and I will try to make sure that I let you know when I'm telling you what my beliefs and concepts are and where we're dealing with peer-reviewed science. So I want to start out with some words that keep coming to mind the more I do this work. Now, one of them is unity, and the other is transformation. And the third now that's coming up more and more is consciousness. Unity is the state of being united or joined as a whole. And it's being together or at one with someone or something. And it's the opposite of being divided. Transformation is defined as a metamorphosis during the life cycle of a human being. And finally, consciousness is awareness of the mind, of itself and the world. And I think all of these three concepts are part of what I would believe is a deeper dive into what this science means, to what it means to be trauma informed, and that there are elements of the power of this information to transform communities into healing communities. I will be using a little bit of art and some photographs. This is my favorite photograph by W. Eugene Smith called The Walk to Paradise Garden. And I like to show this because I see these children on this pathway, the pathway representing the pathway of human development, and the wish for every child for their development to be healthy and for them to reach their full potential. And that's what I see as the hope that's represented in the light in this meadow that they're walking into. And at the same time, what we've learned is we need to be able to look at the truth of our culture and cultures around the world, that many children experience adversity, and sometimes many forms of adversity. And that represents sort of this contrast and tension between that bright future and this sort of shadowy foreground in this photograph. This is my representation, and it's sort of an engineering style. I don't mean to make this a linear engineering presentation, but this is the best I could come up with, where we have these gears, and there's a belt connecting these different gears, and there's arrows, the blue arrow and the orange arrow, that go in different directions. And I want to start with the largest gear in self-healing communities, which is the population of people affected by adverse childhood experiences. And that is the largest gear in my mind for several reasons. First, because every survey in any population in this country or around the world has shown that most people, the majority of people in any population, have experiences one and usually two or more adverse childhood experiences. And also because I believe that the real power for transformational change in communities will come from the lived experience of people that have had adverse childhood experiences, and what we or they can share about themselves with their friends and neighbors and with the human service systems that interact with them that are represented in these other gears. I've put in the education system, the justice system, child and family services, and medicine and public health. And the idea of this is, in healing communities, is to get these gears turning towards healing and reducing the transmission of adversity from one generation to the next, and getting the gears moving in a way that in the future, we will have fewer and fewer of the many public health and social problems that we have in our communities today. And that includes healing at the individual level and healing at the systems level. In many of our systems, the arrow that's moving these gears is the blue arrow, which is moving counterclockwise in a way that tends to intensify or make the adversity worse. We have many inherited policies and practices that I'm sure will come up during discussion that tend to lead adversity to progress throughout the life course. So there's both the individual level, the community level, and the systems level look at where change can occur to lead to healing in communities. I want to spend about 10 or 15 minutes talking about the biology of adversity. When we first got the results from the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, this biology was not known, and I'm very excited about what we're learning about how adversity influences human development biologically. So when I'm talking about adversity, I'm talking about stress, the human stress response, or what we call the fight or flight response. When we are stressed, two things are released from our adrenal glands: adrenaline or norepinephrine and cortisol. The adrenaline raises our blood pressure and gets our pulse going so we can fight or flee. And the cortisol is a steroid hormone that helps us in the intermediate term during stressful conditions. And so if you look at this diagram with the arrows going to the left, if that stress is unpredictable or severe, it leads to a higher level of vulnerability, a biologic vulnerability to the pathways that stress can lead us toward. And if it's predictable or moderate, it leads to lower vulnerability. I believe we're all vulnerable in one way or another to the stresses of life. So there's no place where I would say there is zero vulnerability to stress. And I want to emphasize the steroid hormone cortisol, which you see up at the top. That hormone, if it's released frequently or in very high doses, is toxic to developing nerve cells. It also has other metabolic effects. We're going to focus on its effect on brain development. In very high concentrations in animal studies, cortisol can actually kill brain cells. So what's of benefit to us if it's predictable or moderate becomes a biologic hindrance to our brain development. So the number of episodes are important. How many times do these stressful events occur, which would in turn determine how many times these chemicals are released, and whether or not the stressors are chronic. Happen just once, or do they happen repeatedly over the course of human development? So these chemicals can influence the way our brains develop and function. And I'm also going to be talking about another very exciting science called epigenetics that tells us that our experiences influence the way our genes are expressed. This slide is the cover art for an American Medical Association newspaper that came out, I believe it was right around the time where we were designing the ACE study in the early 1990s. And I know it's hard to look at, but I show you this because for two reasons. One is this is a snapshot of the intergenerational transmission of adversity. Adverse childhood experiences are transmitted person to person, almost as if they're a virus. It's the way we interact with each other, generally speaking, when we're talking about ACEs. The way we interact with each other results in the transmission of the stress response. So we see here a dinner table for a family where there's a brooding father who looks very angry and dangerous, and a mother who looks like she's also angry. And these parents are having difficulty managing what's ever happening in their home. And there's a young child who's experiencing that stress response. Now, we don't know what's going to happen to that child, whether this is a one-time stressor or a chronic repeated stressor. But this is a snapshot of the transmission of adversity from one generation to the next. And it took me a while not to, as I began to learn and became trauma-informed, to look at this piece of art differently. When I look at it now, I see those parents and I wonder what their dinner tables were like or what their childhood experiences were like. And I want to know their story, because parenting can be more difficult for people that have experienced adverse childhood experiences. And we can always help families to do better. We may not eliminate the transmission of adversity, but we can reduce its frequency and intensity. So I want to know about these people's lives and what we can do to help them to do a better job managing situations like the one we see at this dinner table. This is a very popular slide that shows on the far left panel about a dozen brain cells at birth. And when we're born, we're largely unwired. The wiring of our brain happens mostly after birth, and that requires experience from our senses. So in the middle panel, at age 6, we see that same set of neurons that we saw at birth now have many hundreds or thousands of interconnections. And whatever part of the brain this might be in, this little microscopic set of neurons, has received input from the senses enough that those neurons are wiring up to create a response to the sensory input that will result in some form of functioning that helps that person to work in their environment. At age 14, on the far right, you see that there are fewer connections than there are at age 6, because at about the time of puberty, there's a process that neuroscientists call pruning, wherein some of these potential connections tend to withdraw and usually become dormant. It doesn't mean that they go away, but they tend to become dormant. And so this would be an example of why neglect would be powerful, because if we don't get the experiences we need to have the kind of functionings in life that we'd like to have, those neural connections tend to withdraw. And after that time, it's more difficult. It doesn't mean those functions can't develop, but it's much more difficult for those functions to develop or to develop them fully. So that's why neglect is so powerful. So what gets experienced gets wired. And this concept of adaptation is a fundamental underpinning of the idea of being trauma informed, that our sensory input is taken in and we wire up to function in the types of environments in which we live. And that's an adaptive response. More and more neuroscientists are not liking to use or telling that we shouldn't use the term maladaptive. I want to turn now and spend several minutes talking about our genetics or our genome and how stress or adversity can influence the health of our genome or the way that our genome functions. Here we have a slide of 2 human chromosomes, our packed DNA in the nucleus of our cells. And in this photograph on the ends of the chromosomes are colored. That's called the telomere. It's like an end cap of a shoelace that keeps the DNA from opening up and fraying. It needs to be tightly packed and well organized to stay healthy and for the code within the chromosome to unwind and be used properly. Telomere length, we know now, can determine whether a cell can be reproduced. And there's also emerging research that suggests a link between the shortening of telomeres due to exposure to stress and certain diseases, including diabetes, dementia, and I believe other chronic health conditions. So what does that have to do with today's presentation? We know that telomere health or telomere length can be impacted by exposure to violence. And even in a twin study, a longitudinal study of twins, researchers found that the twin exposed to violence had shorter telomeres than the one who was not. So that would mean that it was the difference in the experience between the twins and not something that was genetically inherited. And the good news is that the telomeres in individuals removed from a violent environment by age 5 showed improvement by age 10. So the telomeres can heal and become better protectors of the integrity of our chromosomes. Now I want to talk about this very exciting field of epigenetics. We're going to start here at the bottom. We've seen the chromosomes in that slide with the tightly packed DNA, with the telomere on the end of the cap, maintaining the integrity of the chromosome. And now in order for our DNA code to be read, there has to be an unwinding of this long length of DNA. I'm told that one strand of DNA in a chromosome is probably about 6 feet long. So you can imagine this tiny little packed area and something of that length. In order to unwind, it has to be very well organized. And I use the analogy of going fishing with, say, 200 or 300 yards of fishing line and not having a reel, and you start throwing the fishing line out and trying to catch something, you would end up with a tangled mess. So in terms of DNA, there has to be this very well organized unwinding that you see until you get up to the center of this slide where you see the ribbons of DNA wrapped around the yellow balls, which are like kind of like the fishing reel, I think. Those yellow balls are proteins called histones. And as you see in this graphic, as it expands and you see the DNA wrapped around the protein balls, there are little orange cylinders attached to the DNA and to the protein. The attachment of chemicals, those chemical attachments determine whether or not the final stage of unwinding of our DNA, which is at the very top of this slide, where the gene code is presented to our cells. whether or not that gene code can be opened up and presented for the cell to read and create proteins, can be blocked by the attachment, those chemical attachments represented by those orange cylinders. And what we're learning, this is the field of epigenetics, the control of which genes are opened up for the cell to read and which ones are not, is something that outside influences from our senses, including adverse childhood experiences, can determine whether those chemicals are attached and block the opening of the gene to be read, or whether those chemicals detach so the gene can be read. So it's kind of like the orchestration of music. And so the turning on and off of genes is what determines how different cells in our body function. And now we're learning that the experience of adversity influences gene expression through these epigenetic mechanisms. So the memory of our experiences is stored in our bodies through the influence on brain development and through the epigenetic influence of experience, and that determines how our gene code is used. I believe these two things are the most powerful explanations for why the adverse childhood experiences study and many others show such a vast array of influence on the pathways of human development and to pathways to many health and social problems. So this is what Vincent Felitti and I called the ACE pyramid. If you look on the far left, you see an arrow from the bottom starting at conception going through death. So if you imagine this arrow going up through the pyramid, this is a life course model. Starting with our initial hypothesis that adverse childhood experiences may lead to things that are on the upper part of this pyramid, where there are social, emotional, and cognitive issues or risk behaviors in people's lives, disease, disability, and social problems, and early death. And what we hypothesized is that adverse childhood experiences may be the underpinning beginning part of pathway to the higher parts of the pyramid. And we were frustrated that our society tends to wait until there are impairments or risk behaviors or health and social problems, and then we try to change them. And that's a good thing that we try to do that, but many times it doesn't work well, or it's only partially effective, and it's a very expensive model for dealing with the wide array of public health problems that we see in our culture. So this was our idea, and we learned after our study was done about what I told you about how adverse child experiences influence neurodevelopment, and the even newer science telling us the epigenetic mechanisms by which these experiences influence our bodies. And importantly now, we need to remember that this is an intergenerational cycle where there's adversity that goes unimpeded. The kind of experiences that are experienced in childhood tend to be the kind of things that become adversity for the next generation. And the sophistication and learning about this ACE pyramid keeps changing, and I'm sure it will change in the future. I just want to show you this briefly. This is the newest ACE pyramid that we have. You'll notice on the left, it starts with preconception. What we're learning from epigenetic research is that the changes that come from experience that are epigenetic can be transmitted from one generation to the next. It's not necessarily so, but in many cases, it's possible that the experiences that our ancestors have had that we inherit in terms of epigenetic coding and which genes tend to have those chemicals attached to them. So we've included now preconception, and we've added to the lowest level of the pyramid our understanding that historical trauma, such as the legacy of slavery or genocide, or other historical factors like famine, can influence how much adversity there is in childhood in a population, and the reminder that it begins usually with the intergenerational transmission of adversity. So this is some of the more recent ways of thinking about the flow of adversity in populations and where we're taking our understanding so that we can do a better job of preventing them. So I'm going to go back to the ACE study we did with the CDC and the Kaiser Health Plan. The first thing we found is that adverse childhood experiences are common. We grouped the first 5 experiences into a group called household dysfunction, substance abuse, parental separation or divorce, and we chose that to represent the possibility that there was relational stress in the household, not to judge separation or divorce. Growing up with mentally ill household members, witnessing domestic violence, or having criminal behavior in the household that resulted in a member of your household being incarcerated while you're growing up. 3 forms of abuse: emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. And 2 forms of neglect: emotional and physical neglect. And you can see here with these percentages just how common each of these experiences were in the Kaiser Health Plan. So the ACEs were common, and there were 10 of them. When you look at the white font, there were 10 adverse childhood experiences. So first we found how common ACEs were, and that was a shock to me how common it was in this population, and how common now we see it is everywhere around the world. The next thing that we saw is that these 10 adversities rarely occur in isolation. They tend to come in groups. So the way I represent this is using this table. If you were one of the 17,000 people that participated in our study and you told us that you grew up in a household where there was substance abuse, that would be your first adversity, the first of the 10. Your chance is a percentage chance of having one of the other 9 on average in a population would be 81%. And even as high as 4 or more, there would be a 58% chance in a group of having 4 or more if you have that first one. So the way we dealt with intense grouping or clustering was to simply create a score. We simply added up each of those 10 ACEs for every person in the study to see how many they had. They only counted 1 point each. We didn't weigh one more than another. And now that we understand the biology, this score that we call the Adverse Childhood Experiences score, I think of as a measure of the cumulative exposure to stress, or a stress dose in childhood. These were the ACE scores in the Kaiser Health Plan. 1 in 3 had an ACE score of 0, 26% had 1, and as many as 16% had 4 or more of those 10 adversities growing up. So we decided to use that score and go back to our idea, our hypothesis that adversity is the underpinning of many health and social problems. And I'm going to go through a few of those findings now, starting with mental health and substance abuse. Here we have the ACE score and the percentage of people in the study who self-reported ever being addicted to any drug, whether it was a street drug or a prescription drug. So the height of these red bars is the percentage of people that reported ever having a problem with addiction. And across the bottom from left to right is the ACE score, increasing from 0 to 5 or more, which I now think of as you look at this from left to right, is increasing exposure to the biologic impact of adversity. And we see this sort of staircased, what we call dose response effect. As the dose of adversity or stress goes up, as represented by the score, the percent addicted goes from 1% for a score of 0, it doubles for an ACE score of 1 to 2, and goes all the way up to between 9 and 10% for ACE scores of 5 or more. These are really dramatic increases, doubling, tripling, quadrupling, or up to a 9 or 10-fold increase in the risk of addiction, depending upon how many ACEs were experienced. And so we call this dose response. This is the ACE score and the prevalence of attempted suicide at any time in life. The height of the yellow bars, just as the last bar graph, the height of those bars is the percent of this problem which is ever attempting suicide. And again, these are really dramatic increases from about 1 or 2% for an ACE score of 0 to 3 or 4%. And this stepwise increase all the way up to 20% for an ACE score of 4 or more. So if you look at the height of the bar on the right for ACE score 4 or more, it's 20 times higher than the bar on the far left for an ACE score of 0, which means that the risk of attempted suicide increased 20 times across ACE scores. And we also learned, and this was sort of a shock and came as a surprise to the scientific community, that ACEs were a pathway to many chronic illnesses decades later in adult life. Here we see the similar pattern showing the ACE score and the risk of liver disease here with the staircase dose response pattern. And what we know now from the ACE study is that ACEs increase the risk of alcohol, excessive alcohol use or alcohol dependence, the risk of shooting up drugs with a needle and syringe and potentially being infected with a hepatitis virus. And it also influences sexual behavior, and the hepatitis virus can be transmitted sexually. So the reason why you see this pattern is that ACEs increase all of those risk factors for things that can damage liver cells. This is the ACE score and coronary heart disease. For this particular chronic disease issue, it was only at the higher ACE scores that we saw an increase in the risk for coronary disease, where it about doubled. And I just want to say that for these bars at 3 or 4 or more, the risk for coronary disease comes mostly from something other than what we know to be as the traditional risk factors for heart disease, like smoking or high blood cholesterol or diabetes. We were able to statistically adjust for those, and it only accounted for about 1/3 of this increased risk. So there are other pathways by which ACEs can lead to many health and social problems. And I think in the future, we will probably see how this works from epigenetic research telling us the biologic pathways that increase the risk for coronary disease. So this is a quick summary of some of the peer-reviewed publications that we did showing that ACEs have a strong influence on many health and social problems, including adolescent and reproductive health, smoking, the risk of smoking, body weight issues, alcohol use, illicit drug use, sexual behaviors, mental health, the risk of violence and re-victimization as an adult, the stability of relationships, and the ability of people to perform their work on the job well. And here are some of the chronic diseases that are associated with higher ACE scores: heart disease, lung disease, stroke, diabetes and cancer, lung cancer and liver disease, suicide, injuries, HIV, AIDS, and other sexually transmitted diseases. We're also learning that adverse childhood experiences affect our immune systems in a way that we tend to develop chronic inflammation and autoimmune diseases. And we also saw that for high ACE scores, on average, people with ACE scores of 6 or more compared to an ACE score of 0, on average, die about 20 years earlier. So I want to stop here for a second because there's a tendency to take these really powerful risks for health and social outcomes, including chronic diseases, and begin to try to apply a disease model to our experiences. So I just want to say, ACEs are not a disease. These are our stories. the stories of our childhood experiences. And we need to be careful not to treat them as though a disease, or to treat an ACE score as if it is a disease or a condition. Our experiences are neither diseases nor conditions. And this will probably come up in our discussion about the idea of screening for adverse childhood experiences. That's an important topic. The other thing to remember is that adverse childhood experiences are not dusty. Although there's powerful increases in risk, those are at a population level in epidemiologic studies. There are no one-to-one relationships between any ACE score and any health or social problem that I know of that's been studied. So a score does not mean that any person is destined to have any one or necessarily any of the health and social problems that we describe today. But they do create risk at the population level, which brings this into the idea of taking public health or population or community level approaches to reducing the risk as a group for these health and social problems. So that's the idea of self-healing communities. So we've looked at how adversity influences populations of human beings and how that increases risk. Let's take a look at a couple of the influence of ACEs and how they play out in two systems, the education system, and then I'll follow with looking how they play out in terms of the justice system. Let's take a look at the impact of ACEs on students and student learning. This data comes from Dr. Chris Blodgett at Washington State University in Spokane. I believe Chris is one of the leaders on the cutting edge of being able to go in and collect data, live data in public school systems. He was able, by asking the teachers and the adults or caregivers who knew the children, he didn't ask the children, but he was able to assemble ACE scores for children in the elementary school system in Spokane. And he found that among students with 3 or more adverse childhood experiences, the risk of academic failure increased 3 times. Poor health, as you might expect, was 4 times more likely. Severe attendance problems were 5 times more likely. And severe behavior problems were 6 times more common in students with 3 or more ACEs. So what Chris did was to take these 4 different issues affecting students and say, how many of those students had at least one of those, which is what the height of these blue bars is. It's the percent of elementary students with 1 or more of those 4 school problems, with the ACE score going from 0 on the left to 3 or more on the right. So you see it goes from about 30% for an ACE score of 0, almost doubles for an ACE score of 1. And when you get to an ACE score of 3 more, 80% of students in the elementary school system in the populations that Dr. Blodgett studied have at least one of those school problems. This slide comes from my colleague Laura Porter, who did this in the state of Washington. This comes from random surveys of adolescents, where they were able to assemble ACE scores for high school students. And so what we have here is a statistically representative classroom, a random sample, if you would, of what a high school classroom would look like. There's 30 students, and at the top row of desks, you see there would be 6 students, and you can see the potential ACE scores on their desk. There would be 6 students with no ACEs, and as you move down, you see 5 with 1, 6 students with 2 ACEs, 3 with 3, 7 with 4 or 5, and 3 students with 6 or more adversities, such that in an average high school classroom, 42% would have 3 or more ACEs, which brings us to the importance of understanding the influence of ACEs in schools and the importance of having trauma-informed policies and practices in our school systems. Let's move on and spend a couple minutes looking at the justice system, or what I learned about the idea of the prison pipeline. I think of adverse childhood experiences and how common they are, and how they influence our development as literally a pipeline of forces that tend to lead to risk for entry into the prison or criminal justice pipeline. I want you to just quickly look at this table. On the far right in this table, those numbers in the gold font they're all just about 70%. And it's from 4 different studies used from different researchers and different samples. And it shows us that on average, about 70% of youth who were involved in the juvenile justice system have diagnosable mental health disorders. So 7 out of 10 on average would have a mental health disorder. And when you take those kids in the juvenile justice system and see how many also have a co-occurring substance abuse disorder, it's 72%. So if you do the simple math of multiplying 70% by 70%, that means about half of the kids in the juvie justice system have both a mental health and substance abuse disorders. And what we now know from the ACE study and other studies like it is the majority of mental health and substance use disorders have their origins in the biology of adverse childhood experiences. This is data from within a justice system in Pierce County, Washington. There was a woman there named Julie Gredstad who contacted us and wanted to know if we could look at ACE scores and what happens to the youth who were on probation in that county. And we were to assemble pretty accurate ACE scores from their intake questionnaires. And so this is the ACE scores and the risk of felony reoffense probation going from left to right with ACE scores. First year in the blue or purple bars, and the green bars are within 2 years post probation. And you see this familiar dose response and a doubling on the far right for ACE scores of 4 or 5 or more of the risk of felony offense post probation, which in turn leads to the risk for entry into the adult prison pipeline. I want to talk a little bit about what I believe ACEs do in terms of pathways to poverty, and we have to acknowledge poverty is a complex issue, and there's many forces that generate poverty, but adverse childhood experiences, I believe, are one of those powerful forces. Here we have a survey from 5 different states where ACE scores were obtained, and adults were asked if they were unable to work because of physical or emotional issues, or whether they were currently unemployed. It's these 2 line graphs here. And you see them going up as the ACE scores increase across the bottom, such that if you take the 2 dots on the far right on this graph and add those 2 dots up for ACE score 4 or more, 25% of adults, this was done in 2013, 25% of adults were either unable to work or unemployed as a result of the experiences of their childhood that constituted adversity. And here is the risk of being homeless. This is from Washington State, from their adult survey. The risk of being homeless at least once during adult life for the ACE score. And you see this almost exponential increase in risk of homelessness from about 1% to 25% across the range of the scores. So adverse childhood experiences appear to be the major pathway to homelessness. So I'm going to come back to this important idea of adaptation, that these experiences get stored in our bodies and our bodies are adaptive. And the issue is not whether we're maladapted or not, but we have adaptations that have a downside in terms of the effect it may have on our health, or the way our adapts collide with societal expectations for a behavior, or the way we do things, or the way we can learn. So I want to take the example of cigarette smoking. Here we see a youth smoking a cigarette, and I now think of cigarette smoking, given that everyone understands that cigarette smoking is a health risk, as an adaptive behavior, because if we inhale cigarette smoke and we have anxiety, depression, or difficulty concentrating, all of which we're at increased risk for if we have more adverse childhood experiences, we get a treatment in that cigarette smoke, which is nicotine. Nicotine is a powerful neurotransmitter that can reduce the symptoms of anxiety, depression, and difficulty concentrating. And it probably explains why people with higher ACE scores initiate smoking and become regular smokers earlier and tend to be chronic smokers into adult life, leading to smoking-related illnesses. So it's a functional behavior that's adaptive that has a long-term negative consequence. So this idea of being trauma-informed, which many of you are probably familiar with, to me is a conceptual frame shift that makes me stop and say, for example, if I see someone smoking, I begin to say, I would like to talk to that person and understand their history, their story, so that I can change my narrative. What's wrong with you? Don't you know better? To understanding what happened and how whatever it is that I'm observing about you might be an adaptation. This is my daughter, Kelsey. And I like to I used to travel a lot before the pandemic, so I would bring photographs of my kids along with me. So this is my daughter, Kelsey, and she saw me present this idea of trauma-informed care was somewhere in New York City. And afterward, she said, Dad, you don't do a very good job of presenting this trauma-informed care. So we went back to our home and my study, and these are some of her ideas that have really helped me go deeper about what I think it means to be trauma-informed and why understanding our stories of adversity is so important. And what we came up with is knowing about the ACE study and ACEs and what they are is it gives you a chance to rewrite the narrative of your life. It provides a chance to see the story of your life differently and to create a different path for the future that alleviates shame, confusion, and understanding these adaptations that have a downside, and that allows us to transition into a different pathway for ourselves that contains the important properties of hope, meaning, and purpose that I think we all need in our lives as human beings. And again, now I want to make sure these are my ideas now of how and why adversity is so important and how we can think about this, how this information can have a transformative effect. This is one of my favorite works of art called The Kiss. I've read a little bit of philosophy and theology, and they tell us that as human beings, we're embodied on this planet for one important reason, and that's to love one another. And they also tell us that we come in with our minds or consciousness, so one of the words I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, and that we have minds or a consciousness that is here for a particular one most important purpose, and that's to seek the truth. You know, the truth with a capital T, the truth of our lives and why we're here, and to find the truths of our existence. So I want to talk a little bit about why I think understanding ACEs, for those of us that have experienced them, can help us heal. So I learned that we have three general faculties of our mind or our consciousness. We have reason, we have our memory, where we have a story about our past, and we have imagination, where we have a story about our future. And this is relevant because our reason is easily overwhelmed by memory and imagination. And now that I think about this a lot for myself, I realize during any given day, my reason, if I get into my imagination or my memory, my reason is easily overwhelmed. And I can think about things that are simply not true or things that are negative. So in terms of ACEs and their outcomes, I believe what happens with the faculties of our mind in terms of memory, the children who experiences these forms of adversity tend, even though it was not under their control, that it was their fault. And that tends to come with shame and fear and a sense of hopelessness that gets embedded in memory. And I don't believe, that's not the truth. The truth is it was not their fault. And the shame that they feel was not a result of their own behaviors. And in terms of imagination, there's a tendency to look into the future and believe that I'm stuck, or that my life is a fixed pattern of adaptations that may not have negative consequences, or that I don't like, that I can't change. And I may be fearful and I'm just coping, and I may have a sense of hopelessness about what's coming next. And what I believe what happens in understanding this material that I'm presenting and what I talk about today is it provides an opportunity to reframe our consciousness and to find what I believe is the truth. This conscious reframing, embedding a new narrative that says, I adapted. I now understand that there's many people like me, that adverse childhood experiences are common, that it can influence the way my brain developed, it can influence the way my body functions physically, and that what happened is not my fault, and that I'm not alone. There's many people that have had these experiences. I think one of the negative consequences of adverse childhood experiences is a sense of isolation. And my experience from doing many of these presentations and people coming up to me afterwards is they express a sense of having seen their story in the story of this presentation or presentations like this. And they can begin to believe in themselves again and not be ashamed that they're good or that they're a divine creation. And that now that they understand the narrative and how things happen the way they did, that they become empowered to use their imagination in hopeful ways, to create new patterns where they can find meaning and purpose. And one of the most common ones I hear is a parent after a presentation coming up to me and saying, I saw myself in this presentation, and I'm going to devote myself to making sure that my children or the children I interact with have fewer adversities than I do. And I can seek truth, and I can love and be loved better. So my belief is that this is one of the reasons why this information is so powerful, and perhaps one of the reasons why, besides the fact that it's very powerful data, that somehow maybe we intuit that this information has that kind of property for transforming our lives. So why is the ACE study so powerful? We didn't know it at the time, but when we called it the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study and used the acronym ACE, that we were creating a common language and a simple term called ACE, an ACE score that people can use. And so that word gets transmitted rapidly from person to person. And any kind of revolution, I believe this is a social or public health revolution, requires a common language that's easy to use. And that language has a conceptual framework that has integrity when it's transmitted from one person to the next. And I believe that the conceptual framework that came out of the ACE study is very powerful. It's been replicated around the world. And it's really pretty simple to understand and teach. And that framework is that ACEs are common. They're highly interrelated. They pile up and have a cumulative biologic impact that's captured by the ACE score. They account for a very large percentage of health and social problems. And now we're beginning to understand in depth, and I'm sure that in the future that understanding of the biology will be even more in depth. But right now, the neurobiology or neuroscience and the epigenetics provide very powerful explanations as to why adverse childhood experiences tend to lead to so many changes in human development and adaptations, and even the risk for chronic illnesses in adult life. And I believe that it's a gateway, that gateway to empathy and compassion and healing communities, and this gateway to these underpinnings, the deep underpinnings of how we look at each other and interact with each other that underlie the idea of being trauma-informed. I'm going to transition quickly here. Many times I've seen it said that ACEs are the most powerful determinant of health and social well-being, and I believe that's true. And it's true because the data are so powerful. This slide shows ACEs and population attributable risks. And I'm going to take a few minutes on this slide. This is what we call the oil slick slide. A colleague of ours created this slide years ago when the BP oil well blew up in the Gulf of Mexico, if you remember that, and many millions of barrels of oil spilled into the ecosystem of the Gulf of Mexico and contaminated and damaged that ecosystem and the creatures that live in it. And so she decided to use an oil slick as a representation of the impact of the biology of adversity on human populations. So we have here a circle, a pie chart with multiple different health and social issues represented by each slice of the pie. And the percentage on that slick, these numbers, are the percentage of those problems that are caused by, based upon our calculations, that are caused by adverse childhood experiences. And I think it's now pretty incontrovertible that these are cause and effect relationships because we see the biologic pathways and biologic markers from brain scans and from epigenetic studies telling us how this works. So let's take the very top slice of this pie. For current depression, we estimate that adverse childhood experiences cause 50% of current depression in human population. It's not that the risk of current depression is 54%, is that if we could blot up all the oil or keep that oil from spilling out into human populations, 50% of current depression that we have now would go away. So this represents the extraordinary prevention potential that comes from reducing the intergenerational transmission of adversity. So going counterclockwise on this chart, 52% of disability days, a little more than half of domestic violence, almost half of high-risk sexual behaviors, almost 80% of intravenous drug abuse, 2/3 of people whose quality of life is poor, such that they describe their lives as dissatisfied, 2/3, almost 2/3 of alcoholism, half of any drug abuse, almost 60% of suicide attempts, and 40 to 50% of people describing their lives as hopeless have their origins in adverse childhood experiences. So soaking up the oil slick has tremendous potential for each one of these. And perhaps more importantly, all of those would go down simultaneously. And so I don't think there's ever been anything that we found in terms of epidemiology and public health, and now understanding the biology of how that works, that has such tremendous potential, that focusing on a set of adversities and preventing them can reduce the majority of many major health and social problems individually and collectively reduce them all simultaneously. I'm getting ready to close out now, but I want to talk about a very important concept that I didn't realize for a few years until after a few years of doing this work, that adversity tends to be progressive in the life course. And I'm going to carefully walk you through this. On the left, we see adverse childhood experiences leading to predictable patterns of brain development, traits, and behaviors that tend to lead to things like these in these three boxes. Slowed language and reading, lateralization, which is using one side of the brain, usually the left hemisphere or right hemisphere more than the other, lower IQ scores, poor decision-making skills, problems with recall, memory problems, attention problems or ADD or ADHD. And stopping here briefly, it's very important to understand that exposure to trauma and adversity in children can lead to the childhood equivalent of the adult condition known as post-traumatic stress disorder, even though it's an adult diagnosis. And that childhood equivalent of PTSD can look very much like ADD and ADHD. And the challenges going forward is to sort out which is which, so that the treatments can be tailored and that inappropriate treatment with medications for ADD and ADHD is not applied to children who don't have those conditions, but whose behavior and health issues are related to the biology of adversity. And then aggressive behaviors, social isolation among peers, poor understanding of social cues leading to conflict, and then early use or abuse of alcohol, tobacco, illicit or prescription drugs. An increased risk of being assigned to special education, failing in school or dropping out, and then suspension or expulsion, delinquency, and increased risk of entering into the prison pipeline. And then the risk as an adult of having these forms of adult adversity, low-wage jobs, unemployment, requiring public assistance, being incarcerated, having chronic health problems or mental health and substance abuse issues, and parenting and relationships tend to be more difficult, which then creates that intergenerational risk that I talked to at the beginning of the presentation. So this particular slide, which you will have as a PDF, I think if you take the time to look at once we know the pathways by which adversity progresses, we can look at each one of these cuts, and there are others probably that we'll learn about. Each step along the way, there may be things that we can do differently in terms of providing support or changing policy and practice in ways that tend to enhance the progression of adversity, such that we will lead to an adult population or even an adolescent population that has less of these problems that get transmitted to the next generation. So there's two fundamental questions, and ultimately, Dr. Folletti and I did this work because we wanted to move towards prevention. Working at the top of the ACE pyramid is a worthy thing to do, but as I mentioned at the beginning, many times it's ineffective and it's very expensive. So I want to get the focus back on prevention, preventing the proximal childhood causes of this flow of adversity that leads to these consequences. Are we slowing or halting the progression of adversity in the life course? And reducing the person-to-person transmission or intergenerational transmission of adversity. So I want to make sure that we bring the focus back to prevention, because there's a tendency for us, and I know with my training in adult medicine, to drift up higher in the pyramid and wanting to intervene in ways where we forget the common goal and thinking about that oil slick slide. If we can stem the flow of oil into the adult population, we have an unprecedented in human history opportunity for preventing these types of problems and for enhancing human well-being. I am going to ask Tom, though, there's a very brief video that I would like you to see. It's about 5 minutes, and then I will spend about 2 or 3 minutes closing out, and we will go to our panel discussion. So Tom, if you could cue up the video, let's do that now.
Okay, will do. Let's see here. Okay, everybody should be able to see it now, and I'm playing.
It's time now, everyone. We're gonna do the compassion trauma circle. Is everyone ready to face their past with compassion? Is that a yes? Yeah! While you were growing up, during your first 18 years of life, if a parent or other adult in the household often or very often would swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, step inside the circle. If a parent or other adult in the household often or very often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or threw something at you, step inside the circle. If a parent or other adult in the household often or very often ever hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured, step inside the circle. If you often felt that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special, step inside the circle. If your family lived in extreme poverty, step inside the circle. Step inside the circle. Step inside the circle. Step inside the circle.
There is no shame. There is no shame. There is no shame.
I'm so good. Good to see you. How are you? Amen. Noel, good to see you. Welcome. I was abused as a young girl. I was beaten by my mother. I was verbally abused by my mother. I was sexually abused by another man. My father was an alcoholic. My mother was a rageaholic. I've driven drunk. I've sold drugs. I was a juvenile delinquent. Probably my story is similar to most of your stories in here. I'm white and I'm female and nothing happened to me. So, I got a get out of jail free card. And so I'm here now because I see myself in every one of you.
I'm a traumatized child, raised by a traumatized child. My mother was traumatized as well as her parents.
Like he said, we wasn't born in the world of being evil people. My mother didn't want me. She hid her pregnancy. She tried to flush me down the toilet. But as I learned about these things, I always asked myself what was wrong with me.
When I come to the circle and I see everybody else and she's reading off the questions and people stepping in further, and I look at my childhood and I'm like, a lot of these people in this yard are just like me.
There was one step I should have taken that I didn't take, and I saw some of my brothers and my friends take that step, and I felt like such a coward. You know, I wasn't brave enough to be there with them when they took that step. And every round after that, I took the most difficult step.
Our traumas kept us separated. We were all on the circumference, all standing apart. But once we began to acknowledge our traumas publicly, it brought us all closer together.
In prison, you're not supposed to show your weaknesses in prison, though. But to want to do that, to walk in that circle like that, and to take each step forward was a reminder to ourselves that we still have a humanity and we worthy to be loved, though. Most people on the outside don't understand that we want to change so we can re-enter society better than what we left it.
And I think one of the things that when you was yelling that no shame and you had us yelling it out, it was freeing us too. And it was a point to where when I was looking at that and we was all looking at it in a circle, you can hear that echo, no shame. And that was very powerful, especially coming from a little lady like you.
I'm 76 years old. I've seen a lot. I don't like talking. I like to meet people that understand what's happening without words, and you one of them. Today has been one of the best days I had in my whole entire life since I've been out to these 40 years.
Thank you, Tom. I'm going to go back and share my screen. Before I close my part of this, I'm hoping that maybe sometime during our discussion I'll be interested to hear your thoughts about what you heard from those men in that prison system. What they said reinforces many of my beliefs about why this information can be so powerful for them or for any group of people that have had a lot of adversity. But ACEs, one of the power of the ACEs epidemiology, the information, is it has a unifying effect because it is the major cause of mental illness, addiction. It's also a major cause of domestic violence, disrupted families and relationships, suicide, chronic illness, school issues that we review today, or quote unquote school failure, crime and mass incarceration, poverty, homelessness, health disparities, why some people in some communities have more health issues than others, the cycle of violence, and early death. And my experience over the years of teaching this is people from all different walks of life and all different disciplines and people working in all different parts of human service systems see common ground, and it brings them together to understand that interrupting the cycle of adversity and the progression of adversity, that working together for a common cause, everybody wins, and all of these types of problems will reduce simultaneously. So there's that unity, that circle that those men were in, and this thing that I think draws us all together for various reasons that can unify us in the way we think, and being truly deeply trauma informed and understanding the concepts of adaptation and the way it influences the way we use our consciousness. that has a transformative capacity, where we can love and be loved better and use the faculties of our mind in a way that tells us the truth about ourselves, that can give us hope, meaning, and purpose, and unlock our potential to serve others, and that our experiences become an asset and that they're not a liability. And that we can see how difficult it is. And rather than blaming and shaming, we can provide support where support is needed so that things are better. It doesn't make, we make things, all the adversity go away, but making things better now means things better for the next generation and less intergenerational transmission. And that we adapt. And that when we have sensory experiences, our body adapt and get us ready to survive and do well in the environments that we grow up in. And that those adaptations, they're probably functional in their own way. They may have negative health consequences, or those adaptations collide with societal expectations. But understanding that this is biology, I believe, helps with the empathy and compassion. And that this information helps us to reframe our consciousness and to use that consciousness in a way that's positive and productive and healing, and leads us to serving each other in ways that reduce the prevalence of these health and social problems and reduce the prevalence of adversity from one generation to the next. So those are the elements of what I call self-healing communities. I believe in this model. I've seen it work. If we have time and you'd like, I can show you some data to show that when applied over time, that multiple health and social problems do go down in communities that can sustain this type of model. So with that, I want to thank you. That was a lot of information. I hope you each got something from it in your own way. And we're going to move on, Gail, to the panel.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Anda. Okay, so we are now going to hear from Dr. Bird Gilmartin. Dr. Gilmartin is a pediatrician from Evanston. She's trained to treat children and their specific physical, emotional, and psychological needs. In 2018-19, Dr. Gilmartin spearheaded an education series that brought together local agencies, healthcare providers, police, and schools to provide training on identifying and preventing child abuse and neglect. Please welcome Dr. Bird Gilmartin.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for your talk, Dr. Anda. I took so much away from it. So as Gail said, I'm a pediatrician in Evanston, Wyoming, and I help do child abuse evaluations for the county that I work in. And I also serve on the American Academy of Pediatrics Council on Child Abuse and Neglect. And I also work with the University of Utah and Intermountain Health's Safe and Healthy Families team on performing trauma screens on pediatric patients to help better identify those kids that are struggling with toxic stress. And I think that one of the messages that just stays with me in the work that I do and stays with me with Dr. Anda's presentation is that ACEs and trauma, and when families make themselves vulnerable and share with us some of what has happened in their life and kind of open that doorway into their life and their experiences, it's really a gift that they give and allows for a deeper and richer understanding of people and our society and our world. And I think that it allows for broader and deeper linkages of trust. And I think those are essential for connection and for moving forward in a more healing and kind of whole way. And I think that one of the big shifts that Dr. Anda even alluded to is kind of changing my mentality as a physician from what is wrong with you to what has happened to you. And, you know, I kind of liken it that if we don't, as physicians, kind of think about how we can best hear our patients and our patients' families' stories and get a more full and complete understanding, we're gonna miss the boat on kind of helping change that narrative and that trajectory. And I kind of liken it to, you know, an appendicitis. If I see a kid in the office and they're having belly pain and I don't identify that that's right lower quadrant and they're not eating and they need their appendix out, I don't just stand to, you know, delay their diagnosis and have more complications down the road. I really can just go totally off the track and miss what's right before my eyes. And I see that with ACEs and trauma, that as a physician, if I'm not looking for what is underlying the sleep problems for the child, what is underlying the behavior problems or the difficulties in school, and is there something there beyond what first meets the eye, I have the potential to totally miss something, to miss opportunities to engage with my families, to miss opportunities for prevention, to miss opportunities for evidence-based treatment for trauma, and kind of build some of those effective pathways of healing for the future. So that's kind of how I frame it in my mind.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gilmartin. I know you have to run. You're seeing patients this afternoon, but thank you very much for participating and weighing in from your perspective.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so moving on, our first panelist is Jen Davis. Jen is currently the Human Services Senior Policy Advisor to Governor Mark Gordon. Prior to joining the governor's staff, she was a consultant for the Wyoming Children's Trust Fund, where she advocated for prevention efforts combating child abuse and neglect. I call Jen an ACEs pioneer in Wyoming. She has worked extensively to bring ACE interface master trainings to Wyoming and to really promote awareness and education about the ACE study and the neurobiology that explains why ACEs have so much effect on people's lives and what we can all do to dramatically improve health and resilience for this and future generations. Please welcome Jen Davis.
Thank you, Gail. Thank you, Dr. Anda, for your great presentation. I always look forward to hearing you speak and really tell a great story. It's beautiful. So thank you so much for your work and for being here with us today. I was asked to be on the panel to share a little bit of perspective about what we have been doing in Wyoming, how we can look to the future of really understanding trauma in our state, and how we can really utilize that understanding to move the needle. So I'm actually a physical therapist, a pediatric physical therapist by trade. I have spent many years as a therapist working in Wyoming, and primarily did my career in early intervention, and then also working in the NICU at the hospital here in Cheyenne. So I've had a great pleasure of working with many families who experience trauma, and that's really what led me into this work. I worked with many families that working with their child for physical therapy was really just scratching the surface for them. It really wasn't in reality what that family needed. What they needed from me at the time was for me to be there for them, to really look at the big picture of their family and what they were going through. I didn't get that training when I went to physical therapy school. And so I learned a lot as I went through my journey of working with families. Probably didn't do my very best with all of the families that I first worked with in my career, not intentionally, but probably because I just didn't know better. I didn't know to look for some of the other things that families were experiencing. I had my tunnel vision for just doing therapy with their child, going in, helping them, and then leaving. And then I would question and get frustrated when things weren't always necessarily improving, or if there wasn't follow through in the family, and truly just not understanding the bigger dynamic. And then as I took a job in more of the advocacy role, I had the opportunity to go to a conference in Washington, D.C., as the organization I worked with was looking at bringing on home visitation. And I heard Dr. Gardner speak about ACEs, and I will say that has probably been one of the biggest turning points in my career as well as my life. I think that it has led me to understand myself and the world around me in a different perspective, and has really led to my desire and passion for spreading this message and letting people know the importance of understanding what others have gone through experiencing trauma, and most importantly, how do we help them deal with that trauma, and then how do we prevent it from going on to the next generation and the next generation. You heard Dr. Anda speak about the epigenetics. We know that we have to understand what is happening in our current generation and intervene so we don't continue to see this. So when I was with the Children's Trust Fund, we had the wonderful opportunity of bringing Dr. Anda and Laura Porter to Wyoming to do the ACE Interface Master Training Program. And we were able to stand that up in the state with a great number of amazing trainers, and you'll hear from one of them here in a few minutes. And that has really taken off in Wyoming. I think we have trained several thousand people in the state of Wyoming. That effort is still continuing with the Children's Trust Fund and with Wyoming Kids First, and the amazing trainers that are out there just spreading that word. We've been able to train the trainers within the state to get additional people talking about ACEs and training within their own organizations and understanding. I think that is the cornerstone that we have to do in our first step of making Wyoming better. Is everyone has a responsibility to understand and know the information. And so I applaud everyone for being on here today, because that's your first step, is knowing and understanding. From that point, we had lots of individuals, and as Dr. Anda talked about, building great communities is understanding then what do you do? You know, it's really great to understand ACEs, but then what do we do to help those individuals who've experienced them deal with that trauma, and really understanding the treatments that are available. Dr. Gil Martin is doing some amazing work in Evanston and with the state of Utah, and really then spreading that message. How do we treat it? How do we treat it effectively? And then the next part, where every single citizen comes into play, is how do we prevent it from happening in the first place? And that's really a huge passion of mine. So we also brought in train the trainer models for the strengthening families protective factors of understanding how do we build capacity in our families that we have and help them to be the very best that they can be. And so that is also, we have wonderful trainers around the state who are training individuals, who are training organizations, of really helping to understand what the protective factors are. We know that those are the most important things that we can do to help families have capacity. And so we've had some great opportunities with that, but we have a lot more work to do in Wyoming. And so In my current role, I am now the Health and Human Services Policy Advisor for Governor Gordon, and honored to be in this position to really get to look at how do we connect from the state level all of these different things together. As we know that there's many players that this impacts through education, through child welfare, through Step Into the Circle, through our prison population. How do we just build a better Wyoming? So the opportunity that I have had here is we were able to partner with the National Governors Association and be part of a technical assistance program for ACEs, and really looking at what other states are doing, what we're doing in Wyoming, how we can improve and build our capacity here by generating a strategic plan, which we have been working on with a group of individuals over the last few months. The other opportunity that we currently have focused on trauma-informed practices is the governor established a health task force, which I coordinate for him. And in one of the subgroups, the social determinants of health, this is one of the priority areas that's being looked at is how do we do a robust trauma-informed practice and care model for Wyoming. I think, and then the last effort that I would say that we have is so much of this is interconnected with mental health, as Dr. Anda spoke about earlier, is what are we doing with our mental health system and how can we ensure that we're really taking a close look at underlying trauma and what that looks like. As you all are aware on this call, we have a very high suicide rate in Wyoming, and how does that play in? As you saw, that's one of the risk factors for having a high ACEs score. And so we've been doing a lot of work about having multi-agency conversations. We actually are convening a human services cabinet where we're talking about these multiple issues that cross multiple state agencies, and how do we start to have better conversation supporting the individuals that intersect with multiple agencies. So those are some of the current efforts that we're focused on here in the state, and really looking at coming together with the multiple groups that are doing this work and figuring out how to put a comprehensive state plan in place where we can really start to address the issues of prevention all the way through intervention. So those are kind of the ideas I wanted to share with you all today, and thank you all for being here, and thank you for letting me be part of this. It's a huge honor, so thank you so much.
Thank you, Jen. Our next panelist is Clark Fairbanks. Clark is the Assistant Director of Youth Emergency Services, also known as the Yes House in Gillette. He is also a certified ACEs and trauma-informed care trainer. His career has spanned more than 35 years working with youth and families, and he continues to pursue his passion for improving the quality of care and treatment through meaningful training and advocacy. Please welcome Clark Fairbanks.
Thank you. It's nice to see so many people participating and getting to hear Dr. Anda speak. 3 to almost 4 years ago, I had the privilege of being invited by Jen Davis to be an ACE interface trainer, and got to experience several days of training with Dr. Anda. And so it's my opportunity to thank Dr. Anda because it's been transformative for me. And I believe that it's transformative for our community and our state. I'll speak today just a little bit about, as I've trained in our community and in Northeast Wyoming on ACEs, I'm often asked about practical applications. How can I implement adverse childhood experience knowledge to my classroom, to my children? And so I believe I'll provide a little bit of my experiences in being able to do that in working with children who have mental health and substance abuse needs, and most specifically underlying that is trauma. And it starts with our belief and our approach to working with children, that we believe that kids do well if they can, and if they can't, we recognize often that it's trauma and adverse childhood experiences that are getting in the way. And so as a professional, we start to ask that question, as Dr. Anda said, of not what's wrong with them, but what's happened to them. And we look to figure out what's getting in the way. It's often similar to looking at other learning disabilities that many of you are very familiar with, but recognizing how ACEs and chronic overwhelming stress can arrest the development, the emotional development and cognitive development in many of our skills. And for me, what that's meant is really looking at what are the lagging skills. The children that I work with at the Yes House and in my past work as a superintendent at the Wyoming Girls School obviously have very high ACE scores. And it often relates to their inability to self-regulate, their inability to be successful in their environments, in society, and the creation of those negative feedback loops that so often impact them. And so when we look at that, it's easy to remember that with ACEs, when they've learned and adapted to some of the most challenging environments in their young life, that many times they have not learned the skills that they need to be successful in our classroom. They've not learned how to use words to express their needs, their fears, their desires, how to make healthy relationships with their peers, how to self-regulate, especially when they feel anxious, scared, afraid. They've not learned how to play and have fun because their adaptations to their environments force them to survive. They've also not learned how to work in a team. And so we start to see how those relate to our classrooms or our living environments. And so our understanding of ACEs helps us pose the question of what happens when we expect our kids to do things that they haven't learned. And again, relating it back to our concepts of a learning disability. When we think of someone who is unable to read, rewards and consequences alone aren't going to change their and create their success as a reader. Similarly with their behaviors, if they've not learned how to self-regulate, if they've not learned how to use words to express their needs. And so our focus is really about creating those environments that they can be successful, to teach those skills. And I've had the opportunity over my years to really see how building resilience, those protective factors that Jen talked about, how building those capabilities, the belonging and the hope trumps ACEs. That those skills allow them to do that. So then we might ask, but again, how do we do that? How do we implement that in our classroom? And it starts with relationships at the core, that we create a safe environment, that we come alongside of our children and help them regulate when they can't. And we move from a rewards and consequence environment to one of teaching those skills, to teaching mindfulness. And I often think of it as I train staff, it's similar in many ways to interval training, that we do physically to try to build our strength, but we do that emotionally for our children. At the Yes House, we call it positive practices. When we look at our kids' behaviors, that we take a strength-based approach within our agency in helping our children heal and succeed. Some examples of that, just to talk a little bit about that, for our agency, we've really strived to move from a trauma-informed agency that recognizes not what's wrong with children, but what's happened, to implementing a trauma intervention framework into our practice. So building resilience through skill development, helping them de-escalate when they are feeling unsafe, and creating those environments where they can be successful. Some of those strategies specific to working with adolescents in our classrooms and in our residences and working with families at home, which just yesterday I was doing training, and when we see a small child who kind of melts down and has a temper tantrum and is on the floor and they're just sobbing, and it's easy for us to recognize that they're having a trauma response, and to be able to soothe them and comfort them, and in ways that help them get through that. It's harder when they're 17 or 18 in doing it. But our challenge is to see it very similar, because their development may be arrested at that age group of a younger child. One example in the background, you can see a stuffed animal. We put weights inside stuffed animals, and even our teenagers will go pick that up. It's kind of like a weighted blanket, but it's just something that they can hold, they can rock. They can use that as to feel touch and warmth and comfort. Noise canceling headphones. Many of our kids are really highly stimulated by outside noises, and especially in our classrooms and larger groups. The allowing them to lay down, allowing them to rip paper or go for a walk, creating safe places that they can self-identify to go into, so that they start to learn when they're having a when they're starting to escalate, that they can start to recognize that and intervene in ways. Many of our children just have not learned those skills from their parents or in their young life growing up, and not seen that role modeled by adults as well. Some additional strategies of being aware that sometimes a female presence or a male presence might help in that. And recognizing that it can also escalate. Allowing teenagers to cry. It's often hard for our young adolescent males to do that, but providing a space where they can do that and release that. Some of the things that don't help is obviously when we don't listen to their behavioral cues. Sometimes using humor to them feels like sarcasm, which can be biting and be hurtful to them. Again, looking at it as a learning disability, and the strategy is to increase their skill and to build their emotional competence. In short, what ACES has really provided and allowed our agency and my work to focus on is to reach and help our students in developing a new agreement with our environment and with adults that's focused on fixing the future instead of punishing the past. And with that, I'll just thank you for your time and allowing me to share just some of the transformation it's meant for me professionally. So thank you.
Thank you, Clark. I keep hearing that word transforming, and I think that's definitely a common thread for people who do this kind of work. Our third and final panelist is Carrie Boeddeker Larson. Carrie is a school social worker at Lakeview Elementary School in Gillette, and she is also a Wyoming DARE educator. For 30 years, she has worked in schools and in her community to protect vulnerable children and support families in need of assistance. Carrie is passionate about promoting awareness of ACEs and trauma-informed practices. Please welcome Carrie Boeddeker Larson.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Again, thank you to Dr. Anda. It was an amazing presentation as usual. As Gail had mentioned, I am an ACES trainer, and in our community that has looked like training other schools, and all staff members are trained. During the, when we did adapted learning, we needed to find something for everyone to do. And one of my assignments was to do a presentation similar to this one for our paraprofessionals in our district. And so if they had not received the training before, they were able to receive it in a very similar style that you are learning now. Also, I have had the privilege of training our DARE officers. As the Wyoming State DARE educator, I was able to train the DARE officers with Wendy Gauntner, so our DARE officers have a greater understanding of ACEs as well. I am a Wyoming native. I grew up in Lander on the Wind River Indian Reservation. I worked in Glen Rock for 3 years as the K-4 school social worker, and then I've been in Gillette for the last 27 years as a K-6 school social worker. One of my favorite quotes, I think, just cements what ACEs is for me. It's by Rita Pearson, and she says, every child deserves a champion, an adult who will never give up on them, who understands the power of connection and insists that they become the best they can possibly be. That's always been one of my favorite quotes. And after the ACEs training, I thought, this is why this means so much to me. So to piggyback on some of the things that Clark mentioned, and we're doing even at the school level, is to teach the kids how to express their needs and their fears and their desires. I feel like for a long time, children were just meant to be seen and not heard. And I think we're taking greater steps towards learning, what is it that you need? What can we help you with? When we are seeing kids who are in the midst of a breakdown now, we understand that it is, that they're having these traumatic responses, and what can we do to help them? So now what we do in my school is we have sound sponges. We come and we encircle the child so that they have some privacy, so that they feel safe, so that they know that they can't hurt anyone and nobody else is going to hurt them. There's some things like that that just help them make them feel safer. We are always trying to teach them how to have healthy friendships and healthy relationships with people. We're doing a lot of social emotional learning. At my school, every classroom has a second step kit, and they go in and the teachers teach kids how to make those healthy friendships, how to make those relationships, how to express different things. They're learning how the brain works, and they learn when it gets fired up that they're popping their lid, and what can they do to work on those kinds of things. So we're teaching kids even more brain things so that they understand, hey, this isn't my fault. This is how I need to react to it. Along with that is that self-regulation piece. One of the things that I did after my latest training was I came back, and I'm going to show you a little kit here because it's a very little elementary kit. Every classroom in my school has one of these, and it's a kit for self-regulation. So if you've got a kid that's having a bad day, they can ask the teacher, can I borrow the calm down kit? And everybody has a calm down kit in their room. So it has things like a blanket, because a kid just might need that just because of the softness of it, but they also just may need it as a protectant from what's going on. So you'll see a lot of our kids will wrap up in that. Clark mentioned the headphones. Sometimes kids just need a quiet place. They need to be away. They need to just have that extra help with that. We've got different things that they can rip up, because we don't necessarily want to say, no, you can't rip that. Okay, maybe you can't rip your math test, but you can rip some things. These are just the packing peanuts that come in all my Amazon packages, it seems like. And so kids can rip these. We have things in there that they can use. We've got silly putty. Sometimes they just need some sensory things to play with, things like that. We have different fun things, a stress ball, just some things like that. And kids know at any time they can use this. Sometimes we like the kids to ask first if they can use it. And if they don't have that skill yet to ask, we may just say, hey, do you want to take the calm down kit? Do you need to go use this somewhere? We've got some fun little things. This is actually just an old CD, and it has a marble on the bottom and a cap on the top, and kids can just spin that and watch it go. We've got some fun designs on them as well. We've got some different balloons in there. With COVID, we really had to be careful with these this year just to make sure we weren't passing anything on. But sometimes kids don't know how to do those deep breaths. So if we can teach them how to take a deep breath and blow up a balloon to get some of that stress out, it really helps with that self-regulation when they're anxious or scared. We've got different timers that they can just watch. Teachers may also say, hey, you know, take a couple minutes to calm yourself down, and they know that that means how many turns of the timer. There's just different things like on the we also have a flip chart of calming strategy cards, so the kids can go through and see, okay, I could squeeze something, I could go take a walk. So some of our kids are nonverbal, and we have the autism program is at my school. So a lot of kids will use this to show if they can't speak about what they need, or if they're too upset to speak about what they need, they'll bring the calming kit up. I need to go get a drink, and they'll show this to the teacher. And that's one of the self-regulation strategies. So sometimes they're too upset to talk, and this is a great tool for them as well. Sometimes they just need to think of something else that they can do. And so this is kind of, we call it their cheat sheet if they need it. And it's okay to have that. So just some different fun things like that. Some kids know that it's great to have a fidget if they need it. You know, different things like that. We're working a lot on teaching kids to play and share and work as a team and have empathy as others. That's something that we are becoming better at. Also teaching them how to problem solve. In second grade, we can solve more problems with rock, paper, scissors than a lot of other things. So we're teaching those kids how to be successful, because what they're lacking is the skills. So we need good teachers to teach them how to do these things. And they don't always have that at home. So we try to model that at school. Kind of going back to that, what's wrong with you versus what happened to you. If we can have that conversation with the child, then they feel so much more comfortable coming to us when they do need help. A lot of times after a child has been in the sound sponge that I spoke of at the beginning, we'll say to them, did you have breakfast this morning? Can we get you something to eat? Do you need a cool cloth for your forehead? Do you need just a glass of water? Can we just get you a cup of water? Will that help you? You know, just trying to teach them how to do some of those self-regulation skills. So that's kind of what we're doing. We also are doing positive behavior intervention supports. And so if we do notice a child is struggling, we meet as a building intervention team and we try to determine what else can we do to help this child. It doesn't necessarily even need to be anything academic. Hey, maybe you just need to come in and eat breakfast with me every day. Maybe that's what you need to get there. So there's different things like that. So those are kind of where we have gone at my school and my district at the elementary level especially, but I think it's a very interesting research, and I think it's just continuing to grow statewide, and I'm happy to be part of it, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Carrie. Okay, so the final leg of our webinar, we're going to have a question and answer session, and I want to thank Dr. Anda and all of our panelists for sharing their knowledge and expertise. We are scheduled to run until 3:30, so about another 30 minutes, 35 minutes. I'm going to ask the panelists and Dr. Anda at this point to unmute yourselves and turn your cameras on. Please feel free again to enter your questions into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we will, the panel and Dr. Anda will address those. I do have some questions that were submitted by some folks from around Wyoming, so I'll start with that and we'll keep an eye on the Q&A. The first question comes from Kyle in Jackson, Wyoming, and he's asking, Wyoming is largely a rural state. What challenges does that pose for people trying to deliver trauma-informed care and build self-healing systems? And if you want to weigh in on that, I'm going to ask you to just jump in.
I will go ahead and jump in.
Okay, Clark.
You know what I've found my work in Minnesota, in northern Minnesota, and some of that on the reservation there, but also in Gillette and in Wyoming, is, I think there, in some ways, it's almost easier because we can have such an impact on our community. Carrie has done a lot of training within our school district. Wendy Gautner and I have done a tremendous amount of training. We've had access to presenting ACEs to our city council, our county commissioners, our hospital, to a community education evening within the community. And so I think we have the unique ability, and I would thank Jen for bringing professionals all across our state to be trained in ACEs. And so in some ways, I think we can have a profound impact on our communities, maybe easier because of our rural nature. That said, I think one of the challenges is for us as professionals, we can feel isolated, and conferences like this are really helpful because it brings us, it connects us back together and keeps us filled up with new ideas. So I would just open it up to anyone else to respond.
This is Jen. I would absolutely agree with what Clark said. I think that the rural nature of Wyoming can be challenging in many aspects, but there is such a great benefit of knowing each other in our small communities, being able to easily reach out to each other and connect. I think that the benefit that we've seen even with some of our trainers is that you might live in the small community of Thermopolis, but you're also connected to individuals in Worland. So we'll see those trainers go from one area to another and still have that connection within those communities to help them start to build momentum within their own area. So I think that we are unique in that perspective of having the opportunity to really connect with each other and grow that. As Clark mentioned in his talk earlier, it's really all about relationships. And I think that that's very well done in our state.
I guess, Jen, I have more of a question about that. Is the rural nature of the state for your trainers? Are there concentrated spots where your trainers are able to reach more communities, or are there places in the state where they're having difficulty reaching, and how you might address that?
Dr. Anda, that's a great question. When we did the training with you, we were pretty intentional about who we invited to have a large scope professionally as well as geographically. As with any training, you have individuals who kind of drop out because of life happening or job changes. So I think overall we have been able to get a fairly wide geographical distribution, but I think that there are areas where we still struggle a little bit of having a trainer in that area. Or sometimes the other area where we struggle is maybe one of our trainers is, let's say, an early childhood professional, and the request is maybe to present to a city council where they just don't have that comfort to do that. So we'll pull trainers from other areas to come in and do that as well. So that can be some of the challenge too in the rural areas is we might have one trainer but not have multiple. So we might pull in others as we can.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. It looks like we have a question from one of our attendees. Melanie, can you unmute and ask your question?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you for I was actually typing my question. I frequently run into parents in my community in Wyoming, and I've lived in 2 communities now. One was in Riverton, and one was in out rural Cody. And I run into parents who have less than adequate parenting practices. And I ask, you know, are you interested in learning parenting techniques and things like that? And sometimes I get the flat no, I'm doing great, or I have done what my parents have done. My parents raised me just fine. and I'm kind of stunned. But how can we help the parents? You know, this is all about prevention and helping the future of our children. Is there a website that I could direct parents to, that they could maybe go on their own and not, maybe it's more of a pride issue, like I'm doing great, don't question me kind of thing? Is there a website I could help them, or just even neutrally drop this idea, hey, well, you know, check this out?
Melody, I guess I'll go first. One of the things that we have done is we have offered this training to parents at a parent night. And if you offer food, you get a lot better attendance, we're finding out. So if we have like a big spaghetti dinner and teach people all about ACEs and we'll say, come learn with our staff, not we're going to teach you, but come and learn with us. We can do that. There's a great, after you learn the ACEs, then there's the brain architecture game, which I think is a great way to cement this with parents. And it shows, you know, the different cards that people are dealt in life and how you can build resilience with those. And it's amazing. Other things that my school is doing is we are providing parent education and parenting classes, and my school pays for that. We think it's a great investment. So if court-ordered parenting classes or if they're court-ordered, we say, you know what, that's not a problem because we'll pick that up. My school pays for that. We're a Title I school, and that's a great use of title funds. If your community is offering any type of parenting classes, have your school offer to pay for it. You will reap the rewards.
Can I further my question?
Absolutely.
So one time, this was over 6 years ago in Riverton, the middle school had a fabulous, flew in an author from Boston or back east somewhere, I think it was Boston by her accent. And she had a book called Stopping Shrinking Thinking, something like that. And there were literally 3 families that showed up that night. And it wasn't snowy. It wasn't, negative 15, and the 3 families that showed up were families that I would replicate their parenting practices. Like I looked to them like, I would ask them for advice if I ran into something, but we felt so bad that more people, because I was also on the parent board or helping with, the school PTA, whatever you want to call it. But I think it's some of it is there's an adverse response to parenting. I'm a good parent. Get away from me. Don't tell me that I am doing anything, that's not, don't tell me that I'm hurting my child. And I'm pretty mild. I don't come out, but I think I am a parent and I can always use more good things.
We also have paired with our Eat, Read, and Grow program. So at the same time they're coming to learn this information, they get a box of food sent home with them. They get a box of books. They get, they can come and browse through different coats if they need coats. We have different places within the community coming together to give them things. So they're going to show up, if nothing else, for the free food and then the free giveaways that they get. And then there's not a lot of stigma attached. And we have 400 students at my school, and we will end up with at least 300 families coming. So give a ton of stuff away, and it may take a couple times.
Yeah, they gave away free books and free food, and I think they had pizza or donuts. It was that they had the cafeteria set up with tons of chairs, and it was a hard thing. And I wonder how to approach parents. How does that, if the parents won't listen?
So,
Hard.
Melanie, sorry, this is Jen. I think that this goes back to something that Dr. Anda talked about before, is building those communities and having that conversation with your community partners. When we put ourselves in parent shoes, I think that sometimes when we call something a parenting class, that's offensive to some because it's making a reference that you're not a good parent. And so sometimes just of how we label things can deter parents from that. One of the most important protective factors that we know from the research that really makes the biggest difference is that parent connection. So how do you start to do that? We typically do things in our society in a group manner. I know it's changed significantly with COVID, but that's not always comfortable for parents. I myself as a parent, I am great being in a group with my colleagues to do things, but I'm very uncomfortable to go and do that with a group of strangers like at my kids' school. It's just not my comfort zone. So we need to also think of other ways to engage parents that are creative, that aren't just that typical way that we've thought about it. And Carrie had great suggestions of some things to draw them in, but also thinking about that one thing doesn't fit all. And so those are great community conversations to have with your community partners to see what opportunities you can offer as a community that meet a variety of needs.
Thank you, Jen.
Another quick thing that I do is I have a shirt that says, "Ask me about ACEs." And it's amazing the number of people that'll come up and say, "Tell me about ACEs." And then they don't even know what they've got themselves in for. It's a long discussion from that point on, but it's really a cool discussion to have. You can also put little blurbs in your newsletter that goes out to parents if they're reading the newsletter, things like that, just to kind of get them interested in that.
Thank
Carrie,
you.
I think you might need to sell those shirts.
Okay, the next question is from Marie in Albany County. And her question is, this may be for Dr. Anda, how do ACEs scores in the United States compare with those in other countries or other cultures? Do you have any data on that?
My answer to that is the similarities outweigh the differences. What we do know is that the general concepts about ACEs apply everywhere, that there may be ACEs that are more common in one country than another, or things that happen in other countries, like, for example, forced marriage, or more sex trafficking, abductions, political violence, other forms of violence people are exposed to. But wherever this framework has been used, where multiple forms of adversity have been measured, they're found to be common, and they tend to be interrelated. And when you add them up, the scores show the same kind of relationships that we see in this country. There may be cultural differences in reporting of some forms of adversity. In this country, there's been more open discussion about things like sexual abuse for a number of years, where in other cultures, people are less likely to disclose that can account for differences in the prevalence of certain adversities. Right. But overall, the concepts apply, and the similarities outweigh the differences from country to country.
Okay, thank you. And the second part of her question, maybe Jen could answer. How do Wyoming's ACE scores compare to other states?
Well, that is a very great question. Unfortunately, in Wyoming, we have not done a big data collection around ACEs. But the good news is we did just start this last year. It is included in a survey that the Department of Health does. That's called the BRFSS. It's a behavioral risk assessment that is done across the state. And that's how most states have received their ACEs data. So now Wyoming has 1 year of data, and the goal will be to collect that for several years to really understand what our data looks like in Wyoming. We do have a few places that have collected ACEs data. The Magellan wraparound program in the state collects it. I did a pilot in the Laramie County Jail for a year with a social worker, and we collected the ACEs data there. I can tell you what that data looked like within the Laramie County Jail. Of the individuals that we had over the year over 600 individuals participate with us, and the average ACEs score was a 6 for the men and was a 7 for the women. So that just gives you a little bit of information. But as far as a comprehensive data look for Wyoming, unfortunately, we just don't have that at this time.
Okay. Okay, I have a question from Jan from Torrington, and she's asking, can you give us examples of trauma-informed school policies?
That would be, we use the PBIS, the Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports, is probably the most used one, I would say, probably across Wyoming. There's lots of different places that you could, or places or resources you can use, like zones of regulation is another great step for self-regulation in kids, social thinking, anything to do with executive functioning or growth mindset. Boys Town has a lot of those skills and things, anything collaborative, problem solving based. Is that kind of what you were wanting?
Well, yeah, I think in part, I think when I think of school policies, I think of things like suspension, expulsion. The principal from Walla Walla, Clark, what's his name? Jim Sporleader?
Yes.
Yeah. He talks about having that that target where if a kid is really, you know, in a high state of anxiety, that's not the time to process with them, problem solve, give them time to cool down and things like that. Are you aware of, any of you aware of trauma-informed school policies that have to do with, you know, preventing suspension, expulsion, and being able to provide care for kids that are suffering?
What comes to my mind, Gail, at the S House in our alternative school, which is youth that attend our school that are in treatment, but also from the community that are high risk and have significant trauma, is really more around practices. I mean, we certainly have policies around treating children with dignity and respect always. And the practices, however, are really, we, as I shared in my presentation a little bit, we talk about it as positive practices, in that our staff cannot give consequences unless they address the skills that are lacking that led to that. So that we really shift that framework from a rewards and consequences to really what's happened. What are their deficits? What skills do they need to be working on? And then it changes our approach from enforcement or compliance to really teaching, a teaching model as we address behavior. And it's really been transformative in our agency and in our school to be able to give them and allow them brain breaks, whether that's in the classroom to be able to go outside the classroom and have safe space to be able to do that. And it wasn't without challenge as far as being able to overcome some of our past practices where we would say, well, aren't we rewarding negative behavior? And it isn't about that. It's about building skill. And so I think, and it's a lot like, the Paper Tigers movie, where they really changed that focus to be on what's underlying the behavior, and really investigating that.
Thank you, Clark. And Carrie, you're right. PBIS involves, right, a lot of those same principles.
Right. And with every tier 1 behavior, there's a tier 1 intervention, tier 2 behaviors, and how are you looking at those kids? And like I said, what can you best do, whether it's teaching them a skill, providing them something they need? What is it that we can do to help?
Right.
And Gail, can I just ask a question of Clark and Carrie related to the question?
Sure.
So thinking of policies, Clark and Carrie, do your organization have any policies in place that all new employees have to have ACEs training? Has that been embedded in policies of a district or a facility?
At the school district, we have made sure to offer the trainings. We really hit it hard, I think 2 years ago especially. And now I think anytime there's new staff members, they just kind of pick up the training where they can. I do have it like on my website. I have where they can click in and watch what we had taught during the adapted learning, but it's not required. It would be great if it was. We do have 5 days where we do some teacher training, and that could be something that we add into that. That would probably be very beneficial.
And for us, we have a curriculum for trauma-informed approaches to working with our youth. And then we, as a trainer, I also have the ACEs training that we provide as part of our orientation within the first 3 months of staff working at the Yes House. So.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, this question is from Jeff, and I think he's from Rollins, Carbon 1. And I think it's for Dr. Anda. Since you did the original ACE study, do you know if ACE scores are improving or getting worse? Is there a trend?
That's a great question. There's not real firm data on that. What I do know of is from my colleague Laura Porter in the state of Washington, where they have done multiple surveys over the years asking about ACEs in their general behavioral health surveys, that it looks like the ACE scores may be going up in younger people, and that the scores and the other inference is that the ACE scores in the youngest adults are higher than the next older adults, which can sort of suggest that maybe there's a trend towards higher ACE scores, but we haven't been doing the kind of survey work necessary to really look at that and be confident answering that question. But what we see so far looks like maybe they're getting worse in Washington. Yeah.
Okay. All right. This question is from Jan in Douglas. How can we build resiliency in children?
Well, I'm happy to try to start this conversation. I think the best way, in my opinion, that we look at that is having strong, healthy families. I think those discussions should start from every aspect of our communities, even before a child comes into this world, as you're planning a family, of really being educated about what being a parent looks like, because Those of us who are parents know that even when you're prepared, you're not prepared. So I think the best we can do is support people about understanding what it is to have a child, what it means, what are the questions that you have before they come into this world, because we know once they're here, that's when things get a lot more overwhelming. But I think then the next thing that we do is we need to have very strong connected communities with adequate resources that can really address the protective factors. I think if we can focus on having robust communities that can address all 5 of those protective factors and really get parents engaged in that, that is what then starts to build family resiliency, which then will end up having strong, resilient children as well. Our ideal is to be able to prevent this so that so kids don't have to be resilient towards trauma. So how do we really build communities around that? And it is about a community, and it's about relationships, and how do we build that and make them successful? I'll let others jump in on their thoughts on that as well.
Jen, would you speak about the money that is available, like to different child protection teams and things like that through?
Sure. So at the Children's Trust Fund, they have a grant program that child protection teams is who they partnered with. And the reason for that partnership is because it's already a multidisciplinary group that exists in every county per statute. So they offer funding to those groups to really help them look at resources in their community and build protective factors or build programming. So many communities have looked at embedding what's called the Drug Endangered Children Initiative into their communities, about really is kind of a reframing about how we think about law enforcement and child welfare when there's drugs involved in a home. So that is an opportunity that communities can apply into and really start to do some of that work around building community capacity. I think the other opportunity that's in all of our communities, as well as our prevention coalitions that are through the Department of Health, that focus on prevention of substance use, suicide, mental health. So they're really looking at kind of those same things about how do we build capacities in families. So there's lots of efforts going on out there. But as you all probably know, our difficulty is coordinating those efforts. So how do we come together collectively as a community to really build that capacity? Because that's what families need. And if we don't have a resource in one community, how do we ensure that they get connected with the resource maybe in the neighboring community? So Carrie, those are some of the funds that are available. And then I think the other opportunity is connecting through those prevention coalitions.
I wanted to just, just
ahead.
add to Jen, and I agree, and I think the work focusing on really supporting families and reconnecting extended families and community members around children, and that, but to also recognize that we have the ability to build resilience in our classrooms, in our neighborhood, with our children and grandchildren, and really creating that sense of community around safety and healing. And it starts with those relationships and mentorship, building capabilities, giving kids hope that what's happened to them to this point isn't the end result, that giving them hope for a brighter future, that they can be successful. If they're struggling in our class, that our commitment to them is to help them be to succeed. And then creating that culture of belonging and celebrating their differences and adaptations and their culture, and really so they feel like they belong. And again, I'm stealing this from Dr. Anda. This is all his stuff. So don't make, you know, but it is true. I think when we create those environments, whether it's in our classroom or in our families, we can have that powerful impact.
Thank you, Clark. Very well said. So we've come to the end of our time today. I just want to thank Dr. Anda and Jen Davis and Carrie Bedeker Larson and Clark Fairbanks. What an honor it has been for me to host this webinar with these incredible, hardworking people. I want to remind you there's a link in the chat to an evaluation, and you can, whoop, sorry, I'm trying to share my screen real quick here. You can win these fabulous prizes. So please be sure and fill out an evaluation. And I will turn it over to Dr. Anda. Any final thoughts for Wyoming?
Yeah, final thoughts. I am really hopeful that you have expanded your, you know, through Jen and the trainers, you know, expanded your training. And I learned some new things. I really like what I heard about doing skill building, where children who've experienced adversity have not had an opportunity to build those skills. And I also heard the word executive function somewhere along the line. I'm learning from my colleagues that that's something that many children who experience a lot of adversity, that those skills can be learned. And I think you're really on the right track. I'm very hopeful. I'd like to learn more and maybe catch up with you again sometime soon and see where you are in your progress in this field. And I want to thank everybody who signed up and listened and took the time out of their day to listen to this and learn. And I hope you take it to your families and to your friends, and if you're working, to wherever you work. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to be a part of this.
Well, thank you, Dr. Anda. We're so grateful that you could join us today.